Hi, good morning. My name is Bonnie Lin. I'm the director of the China Power Project and senior fellow for Asian security at CSIS. I'm delighted to welcome you to this hybrid panel on unveiling a survey that we conducted last end of November and early December of leading U.S. and Taiwan experts on various dimensions related to cross-strait dynamics. I have today assembled a very distinguished panel of experts from the United States and Taiwan. But before I turn to them, I wanted to give you a little bit more information and background about our survey before turning to them to really help dissect the survey. So as of, I think, 5 a.m. this morning, the survey has been released, posted on the CSIS website, so please feel free to take a look. We conducted the survey specifically, we timed it so it would occur after the President Biden's meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping, in case anything came from that meeting that may have impacted cross-strait dynamics. For the survey, we partnered with INDSR, and Dr. Chen, the CEO of INDSR, will shortly in a second share some of his views on top takeaways from the survey. For the survey on the U.S. side, our criteria for leading U.S. experts that we reached out to was that they either worked in the U.S. government on a China or Taiwan-related position, or they have testified in front of Congress on China or Taiwan issues. On the Taiwan side, we defer to Dr. Chen and his colleagues on helping us select what he viewed, INDSR viewed as the most representative and leading Taiwan experts. In total, we interviewed about 50, a little bit over 50 U.S. experts and 35 Taiwan experts. We actually ran two parallel surveys. One survey for our English experts was in English, and for our Taiwan experts included both English and Chinese. The survey had 20 questions, and it was largely divided into 4 components. The first assessed China's capability. The second portion assessed key factors shaping China's use of force. The third assessed responses and views of U.S. and United States and our allies and partners vis-a-vis Taiwan. And the fourth assessed larger geopolitical implications, particularly when we look at what might happen after Taiwan's presidential elections. Again, just a reminder, all of these results were collected before we saw the results of the presidential elections. The last the last survey response we took was from December 15th, 2023. Let me just quickly highlight what our report showcases as. We have a wonderful train passing by. What our report showcases as 4 major findings, and I'm sure Dr. Chen and others will cover a lot more. I think the first major finding that we have in our survey is that a quarantine or a blockade is more likely than an invasion in the next 5 years. And here I think it's important before we delve further deeper into the survey, and I think I've actually asked Kristen and Admiral Lee to focus on this portion to define what a quarantine is. I think most of our experts understand what a blockade is. It's a PLA led effort to, and this is the exact language we use in our survey, a multi-domain PLA-led operation to heavily restrict the flow of commercial goods and military traffic around Taiwan. A quarantine, as we define it in the survey, and we provided this exact definition to our survey respondents, is a law enforcement operation led by non-military actors. For example, the China's Coast Guard, maritime militia, that's focused on limiting the flow of commercial goods into Taiwan. So the main difference between a quarantine and a blockade from the purpose of our survey is one is led by the PLA for the blockade, and one is led by non-military actors. A second major portion of our survey looked at, compared, as we looked between the two different surveys, we looked at how leading Taiwan experts responded to questions regarding China and how leading U.S. experts respond. And we found across the board, and I'm sure we'll unpack this too, that there was generally less of a threat perception among Taiwan experts than U.S. experts. And this was not only in terms of China's intentions, but also in terms of China's capabilities. A third major finding we found was that related to this lower threat perception of China was comparing Taiwan experts to U.S. experts, we also found lower Taiwan confidence compared to U.S. experts in terms of how the United States or our allies and partners might intervene to defend or support Taiwan. And finally, the last section looks at what might happen after Taiwan's presidential elections. There's a lot to unpack in that portion, but I'll summarize it by saying that overall, the majority of U.S. and leading Taiwan experts found that the results of the election that we just saw this January 13th, it will be critical in determining Beijing's approach. Very few of the experts saw that Beijing's approach would be the same if Taiwan elected a candidate that Beijing did not prefer versus if Taiwan elected a candidate that Beijing preferred. So I think Ivan will help unpack that. But generally, most of the experts expected some form of change, which I guess to some extent we are seeing already. But with that, let me introduce our four speakers, and I will introduce them in the order that they are presenting. So the first will be Dr. Chen Mingzhi. He is the Chief Executive Officer at the Institute for National Defense and Security Research, and he currently also works as an associate professor at the National Tsinghua University Institute of Sociology. Prior to INDSR, Dr. Chen served as a senior advisor at the National Security Council within the Taiwan government. His academic expertise include economic sociology, contemporary Chinese society, and complex organizations. After Dr. Chen, I've asked Kristen to speak. And Kristen here is a senior policy researcher at the RAND Corporation, focusing on military security and foreign policy issues in the Indo-Pacific. I've had the fortune to work with Kristen many years together at RAND. She formerly served as the director of Navy Asia Pacific Advisory Group at the Pentagon, where she advised the chief of naval operations on security and foreign policy trends in the Indo-Pacific region, with a focus on Chinese maritime strategy and naval capabilities. After Kristen, I've asked Admiral Lee to also speak, particularly about China's capabilities and understanding the China threat. I think Admiral Lee, everyone's probably very familiar with. Admiral Lee Ximing is a senior fellow at Project 2049 Institute. He formerly served as chief of the General Staff of the Republic of China Taiwan's Armed Forces and served in the Taiwanese Navy for 42 years, retiring in 2019. Before his retirement, he was awarded the Order of the Cloud and Banner with a special Grand Cordon by President Tsai Ing-wen in recognition of his service. And last but not least is Ivan Kanapathy. He is Senior Vice President of the National Security Advisory Firm Beacon Global Strategies, an adjunct professor at Georgetown, and a senior associate with the Freeman Chair at CSIS. He probably has other titles, but in the interest of time, we're going to skip that for now. Previously, he served on the White House National Security Staff as Deputy Senior Director for Asian Affairs and Director for China, Taiwan, and Mongolia. Before that, Ivan worked at AIT, representing U.S. interests and advising on military and security issues in Taipei. So with that, let me turn the floor to Dr. Chen, our co-sponsor of this survey. Dr. Chen, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lin, as well as many other distinguished guests, all friends being. Since Bunny has done most of the weightlifting job, summarized the survey findings, I just want to make 4 points that a little bit surprised, but some of them I puzzling and pose some very interesting questions for all of us to think about. First is that Taiwan believes less in China's capability to launch a successful military action to Taiwan. And Xi Jinping would attack. Hold on, wrong one. Sorry. All right, sorry. Let's redo it. Taiwan's confidence in the U.S. is not strong. Very interesting finding. I wonder, can we say this is the success of this the U.S. Strategic ambiguity? Because all the it's very significantly Taiwanese experts view the possibility of the U.S. intervention in time of Taiwan contingency. So first, that is low confidence in the U.S. and by extension, the U.S. allies. Second is about the U.S. experts. Even though more U.S. experts believe that China will use a nuclear weapon, 44%, they still believe more than Taiwanese experts that the U.S. is likely to intervene. And this is sort of contrasting to my first point, that Taiwan experts have a very low confidence in the U.S. intervention. But on the contrary, even though in the context of possibility usage of the nuclear weapon, the U.S. expert still think it's highly likely that the U.S. will intervene. So that is interesting. I mean, does it mean that at least in the eyes of these experts, the U.S. experts, that the so-called nuclear blackmail doesn't work in the U.S. case? I don't know. I just got the result. The original data haven't run the statistics yet. I wonder whether they are highly correlated. Third, Taiwan believes less in China's capability to engage in military actions against Taiwan. Why? It's interesting because everybody knows in the room knows that Taiwan has suffered a lot of influence operations from China. The goal is to project China's military strength. So even given the context that under the influence of the influence operation, disinformation campaign, and we have seen many of them are targeting to discredit the capability of the U.S. military and to project a very mighty image of the Chinese PLA. So why Taiwan is still think less of China's military? I think this is very puzzling why we think it this way. The fourth one is a minor one. It's about the outer islands. The U.S. expert seems to sort of comparatively view the outer islands, Kinmen, Mazu, and the other two smaller islands as more important in comparison to their Taiwanese counterparts. I remember just several days ago, one journalist, I don't know, cannot remember the which one, asked me about the outer island. I just replied then, outer island are still there, probably for good reason, and we don't see that that's difficult to defend, and easy is vulnerable to any attack from China, especially Kinmen is so close to China. So I think this is something that's why Taiwan still think the outer island are part of status quo, and attacking them is not a wise move from the China side. So I think this is the four main points that I like to make, and time allow a little bit more. One, that is the likelihood of military action from PLA in 2024. Majority of our experts think that China will adopt a wait-and-see policy toward Taiwan's inauguration. But we still think, both sides, the U.S. and the Taiwan experts, they do think that any military activities to happen in the Taiwan Strait is highly likely this year. So it's interesting. So under what context and with what excuse will China use to launch an attack, no matter that is a quarantine, no matter that is a blockade or invasion? Well, everybody agrees invasion is less likely, but the quarantine and the blockades are both very highly likely. But doesn't link to the inauguration now, not before the inauguration in May 20th or after the inauguration. So I just wonder how our experts make that judgment, saying that even though 2024 is highly likely to see a military action from PLA, but probably, China will wait and see how the President-elect Lai Ching react to China and what is his new policy toward China. I end here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chen. I don't think everyone necessarily has a survey in front of them, but I think it's worth highlighting one of the earlier points that you said, that figure 8, which is one of our first half survey questions, shows that when we ask the question, do you think China would be willing to detonate a nuclear weapon against U.S. or coalition forces in a conflict over Taiwan, 56% of U.S. experts said yes. 56% said no, and 89% of Taiwan experts said no. So 44% of U.S. experts said yes, compared to only 11% of Taiwan experts. So that was a very stark contrast in terms of our assessment of how willing China was to escalate to nuclear levels. And it's important in talking about nuclear issues here that the question was about use against the United States or coalition forces, not about use against Taiwan. Yeah, thank you. So with that, let me turn to Kristen. Thank you, Dr. Chen.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Bonnie, for having me, and it's great to be on the panel with Ivan and our colleagues from Taiwan. So I found many parts of the survey to be quite interesting, and for my remarks, I wanted to just focus on the few areas of differences, and some of these have already been mentioned, between how U.S. respondents and Taiwan respondents perceive the situation, because I think this points to potential differences in how the United States and Taiwan might assess China's actions and how we might approach potential counters to those actions going forward. So the differences that stood out to me between the respondents are the answers that related to, first, the perception of threat from China, as we've already been discussing, and second, the assessments of the PLA's capabilities, and particularly its ability to conduct some of the more high-end options that the survey asked about, such as a highly kinetic joint blockade or an all-out invasion. And so just to highlight the differences in these areas, I'm just going to go over a few of the survey results because not everyone, I think, has seen it. Compared to U.S. experts, Taiwan experts viewed China as less militarily capable of executing a quarantine, blockade, or invasion of Taiwan in general. So about 90% of U.S. experts and 62% of Taiwan experts strongly agreed or somewhat agreed that China currently possesses the capabilities to execute a quarantine, and 80% of U.S. experts and 60% of Taiwan experts agreed that China possesses sufficient capabilities to execute a PLA-led blockade of Taiwan. So in general, Taiwan experts were quite a bit more conservative in their assessment of PLA capabilities than the U.S. experts were. Another area of difference in the survey is in assessing whether China would be willing to sustain a conflict over Taiwan, and I thought this was also very interesting because it speaks to the difference in threat perception. The survey results show that 71% of U.S. experts believe China would sustain a high-intensity conflict for at least 1 year, but only 51% of Taiwan experts believe the same. And I think this gets into a little bit of the discussion about protracted conflict, that if there were a conflict over Taiwan, it would be a longer conflict, and how we would assess how China would react to that. In terms of a kinetic blockade, most respondents thought that Beijing would undertake that action if it desired to immediately force reunification, but there were some differences in terms of the assessed likelihood of China actually conducting that type of blockade, kinetic blockade. So more Taiwan experts thought that the kinetic blockade scenario would be more likely in the next few years than U.S. experts. And then finally, as Bonnie just mentioned, there were pretty stark differences in views about whether China would be willing to use a nuclear weapon in the conflict. So these are some fairly significant differences in threat perception of China and in the PLA's overall capabilities. And I would love to hear more from our Taiwan colleagues about these responses. But I was thinking one reason for the differences might be a slightly different interpretation of Beijing's objectives for the various scenarios, which is also highlighted a bit in the survey. So for example, 59% of US experts believed that if Beijing were to implement a quarantine, the objective would be to increase significant pressure on Taiwan without escalating to a kinetic conflict. But a third of US experts believe that Beijing would actually undertake a quarantine as a precursor to an imminent blockade or invasion. So that's a difference in terms of how we assess Beijing's objectives for a quarantine. In comparison, only 26% of Taiwan experts thought that China would launch a quarantine with the objective of avoiding a more escalatory conflict, and the quarantine would be a more flexible option and a precursor to more escalatory PRC military campaigns. So again, this highlights the differences in U.S. and Taiwan interpretations of China's intent when it comes to a quarantine scenario. Bonnie asked me to provide my own perspective on this, and so for what it's worth, I do think that a quarantine is the more likely action that Beijing would take over a full-scale invasion or a kinetic joint blockade, at least in the near term, if it wishes to compel reunification with Taiwan and is willing to spend some time enacting the quarantine. And there are several reasons for that, including that China would likely see a quarantine as a lower cost or lower risk means of coercing Taiwan than an invasion because it exploits Taiwan's economic and geographic vulnerability, but it also puts pressure on Taiwan, the U.S., and our allies to figure out how to respond. It places the burden of escalation on us. So the issue of Taiwan's vulnerability to a blockade or quarantine is also highlighted a bit in the survey, where most respondents agree that Taiwan would not be able to resist Beijing for more than 3 months or so absent U.S. intervention. And at least from my own research, that seems to be about the right amount of time. So while avoiding direct military confrontation, a quarantine in Beijing's mind could offer a way through which China can assert sovereignty around Taiwan without starting immediately at high levels of force, as it would with any of the other PLA wartime campaigns. And a quarantine would allow China to show resolve and establish a precedent of imposing will, but it would not necessarily provoke the U.S. to react in the same way as if Taiwan had been attacked. And Beijing could also perceive that a quarantine offers opportunities for the U.S. To de-escalate or for Taiwan to capitulate without either side resorting to military force. And I think this is sort of a dangerous perspective because Beijing might potentially view a quarantine as a less escalatory option, which it isn't necessarily depending on what the potential responses might be. But that is one possible perspective. So I think one of the key takeaways from this survey is that the U.S., Taiwan, and our allies in the region really need to think about how to respond not just to a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, but to the range of options that are below a full-out invasion, but that have the very real potential to endanger Taiwan as well as escalate to a fight. And this creates challenges as we don't have a lot of great options right now should China decide to do something like quarantine Taiwan. So some of the response options can include things like direct pressure in the form of economic pressure, but also military force to break the quarantine. And so while there may be, depending on how China enacts such a quarantine, there may be room to negotiate the movement of particular kinds of commodities or imports to Taiwan. If China declines to allow free shipment, basically no amount of indirect pressure is likely to result in it abandoning its efforts. So then we're left with the more escalatory military options to break the quarantine. A counter-blockade by the United States against China is another option, but it's unlikely to be highly successful because China's economy is pretty large and varied, and it would be unlikely to be very quickly affected by such a blockade. And per the survey, any quarantine on Taiwan is likely to have an effect on Taiwan much more rapidly than on China. So I think the survey's really demonstrated the need to expand the range of thinking and discussion with Taiwan and regional allies and partners beyond a traditional invasion scenario. And then one last point I wanted to make is on the survey results about the possible Chinese use of nuclear weapons, because the differences were pretty stark. This is obviously a very difficult question to ponder because it really gets to Chinese thinking on escalation, war control, and red lines, which are evolving and have been notoriously difficult to determine. I think on the question about potential Chinese nuclear weapons use in a Taiwan conflict largely depends on the context and the situation, and it also depends on the type of nuclear weapons involved. So it's unclear, for example, whether China would view tactical nuclear weapons that have limited effects over small areas having the same escalation potential as a larger nuclear weapon. So while I think the bar is still very high for China to consider use of nuclear weapons, it isn't zero, and these are important issues for the U.S., our allies and partners to be discussing. So thank you, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Kristen. Very thorough. And I'm sure we'll have much discussed because I think some of your views may differ from Admiral Lee's. So Admiral Lee, over to you, and then hopefully we'll turn to Ivan, and then we'll go to a discussion. So Admiral, please.
Okay, thank you, Bonnie. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak here. Yeah, since Bonnie asked me to share my perspectives on the similar set of topics as Christian, so I think we have already discussed some results of survey. So I will mainly focus on my perspective on the China's capabilities, affecting Beijing's use of force and U.S. and allies approach. First of all, in my opinion, the threats from China can be divided into three categories. The first is I'd say coercive threat, which means China uses its military and the law enforcement assets to conduct operations. They are still below the threshold of war and coercing Taiwan to refrain from taking action that China is unwilling to accept. That is the first threat. For the last 3 years, China has consistently been sending its military aircraft and the naval warships on daily routines to operate in the nearby waters and the airspace surrounding Taiwan. If China conducts a quarantine operation against Taiwan, in my perspective, it can also be considered kind of a coercive threat. Then the second one is I will call it intense coercive threat, which means China will conduct blockade operation along with extensive missile and air bombardment to force the Taiwan government to negotiate for unification. Of course, the seizure of the outlying island is also the approach that China may take to force the Taiwan's government to negotiate with them. And I think that the second phase has higher probability than the full-scale invasion. So the last one is I call it the existential threat, which means China decided to launch a full-scale invasion and physically occupy Taiwan. So we're talking about the quarantine. I think quarantine is certainly a flexible option China could use. However, Taiwanese people will not capitulate just because of China is conducting the current quarantine operation, in my opinion. A blockade operation, especially a highly kinetic blockade, along with extensive bombardment, will likely force Taiwan to consider accommodation with China. So if China use quarantine alone, I don't think they would be very effective unless he just wants to send kind of a coercive signal. So quarantine is suitable to be operated independently because it only provides coercive signals and most importantly, it will not interfere too much with other countries. However, China will not assume that the Taiwan would be capitulated on just by a quarantine operation alone. So from the China's point of view, quarantine can be used to deter Taiwan from doing things that China is not willing to accept. However, quarantine will not compel Taiwan to do things that China hopes for. As for how long China might be willing to sustain a quarantine, blockade, or invasion, I think quarantine could be operated indefinitely. Blockade and invasion will not last for too long because they will have a significant impact on regional countries and especially the CCP's internal power struggle. Concerning how long Taiwan could last under the quarantine, blockade, or invasion, I don't think China has already possessed full-scale invasion capability at this moment. However, in terms of hard assets and resilience measures, Taiwan should be able to hold out for 3 to 6 months against the quarantine and blockade operation without outside support. Maybe some respondents will criticize me. I'm too optimistic. But I still think, although Taiwan needs imports 96% of its energy and 68% of its food, I still believe that people could endure more extensively and for longer duration than expected under a very, very difficult circumstance. And in regards to the use of nuclear weapons, I don't think China will use nuclear weapons to attack the United States, because the effectiveness of nuclear weapons lies in not using them, because they are valuable as a deterrence tool. They cease to be useful once they have been used. And concerning the confidence that Taiwan has in the U.S. and ally support, I definitely think that the U.S. will come to aid in various contingencies, because if the U.S. must come in to aid Taiwan, then the United States will probably lose the credibility in the region, and other countries will no longer trust the United States anymore. I stop here. Thank you.
Great. Thank you much, Admiral Lee. I think a number of points showed a different perspective than what Kristen laid out, and I think it reflects the diversity of the perspectives we have both on the U.S. and Taiwan side. Let me turn to Ivan first before we go back to a Q&A as well as questions from the audience, please.
Thanks, Bonnie. Great to be here with Kristen, Admiral Lee, Dr. Chen. I was asked to speak briefly about the results, which you'll see once you take a look at the survey toward the end about China's possible responses to Taiwan's election that happened, this past January 13th. So it's interesting the way the questions were phrased, right? Obviously has an impact here, including like if China views these as favorable, what might they do? If they view the result as unfavorable, what might they do? And I'm kind of was thinking about this yesterday, and I'm sort of like, one of the questions that we didn't obviously ask in the survey was now, after the fact, is does China view the results as favorable or unfavorable? And I think that's an interesting question of its own, right? Because obviously their candidate for president that they would have preferred, I think, did not win. And we saw a response, and I think the most obvious visible response was sort of the diplomatic flip of Nauru, right? And I think that was an option that in the survey, a lot of folks sort of predicted, sort of non-military responses as an unfavorable. But there's also the side that there were some favorable things out of the election. For example, that, I think China feels that they have more, I won't say allies, but more sympathetic folks in the legislature, right, in Taiwan, and that they may be able to actually impact policy going forward in Taipei as a result of that. So I think for that reason, China also might feel like they need to hold back a little bit and not, be seen as over-aggressive, which might be counterproductive. And I think the survey results, both from the American and Taiwan side, kind of reflected that China would operate on the low end of the spectrum. And throughout this section, there wasn't tremendous diversity on any of the questions between U.S. and Taiwan responses. The one thing that surprised me from both sides, I guess because I don't agree with it, is that about 2/3 of American respondents and over half of Taiwanese respondents thought that a Strait crisis is more likely than not in 2024. That's surprising to me. We talk about a Strait crisis. I think the way this question was laid out, We've had a 1995-96 Taiwan Strait crisis. I think you could argue in 2022 we had a Taiwan Strait crisis, whether historians want to label that or not. But I think those two meet a certain level. And I don't perceive, in my view, that it is more likely than not that we will see that this year. But apparently most experts do think that. So that was surprising, just because I think Washington and Beijing, and we can see this a little bit in the U.S.-China relationship and what's going on there, right? There's obviously, I think, from both sides, a desire to not do things that might sort of provoke each other. Washington, I think, is careful because of a lot of, one, it's an election year, and we can talk about that more, but also there's a lot of other things going on around the world that Washington's obviously dealing with now, and sort of not wanting to add to that. For China, just given what's happened with their economy over the last really 10 to 12 months, they are clearly, it seems, reaching out to try to woo and attract sort of Western and foreign investment, including overseas investment, including from Taiwan, right, back in, which a lot of that has sort of escaped over the last year or two. So that's why I'm sort of not as worried about 2024. I think the one thing I would throw out there in 2024, if there is a crisis, I think we need to keep a closer eye on the South China Sea and what's going on with the Philippines. But that's obviously another topic. And then I'll just end. The last thing, there's a great question, obviously, that Bonnie touched on earlier about what's the likelihood of U.S. intervention and different views on that. I think it's important for us all, here in Washington and in Taipei, to keep in mind that the policy process in the United States, it isn't sort of a black and white. There are different types of intervention, different levels of intervention, and I think that more than anything, U.S.-led intervention depends very, very largely on Taiwan's own posture and Taiwan's own response to aggression. And I think we saw that play out in Ukraine, frankly, in early 2022, an example of that. And I think there's lessons that we could gather from that. But I'll stop there. Thanks, Bonnie.
Great, thank you, Ivan, and thank you for flagging what I also thought was a very strong result on the question of the probability of a crisis in the Taiwan Strait in 2024, which, as Ivan said, the majority on both the United States and Taiwan said it's more likely than not. But maybe I could start with that as a question for the other panelists too, just to get your views. Maybe since Kristen, you're right here, and then we'll go to Admiral Lee and Dr. Chen. Are you that worried in 2024?
I'm with Ivan on this one. I'm not as worried because I think I'm not worried about an intentional straits crisis. I am a little worried about the unpredictability that is in the U.S.-China relationship and that sparking something. And I guess that's we've already seen in the last couple of years how unpredictable events can sort of derail the relationship and heighten tensions. And I think, with that as context, that could, along with sort of China's more forward-leaning posture around Taiwan and, the military exercises and all the other things that they're doing, that could potentially spark something. But I'm not as worried about it sort of an intentional crisis.
Dr. Chen, are you as worried or less worried?
Well, as I pointed out, there was inconsistency between how China is going to react to the election result and how our experts view on the possibility for 2024 crisis. From Taiwan, we are professionally pessimistic. I think there is a possibility, and I think there is a temptation for China to test the new president, who doesn't have a very strong background in military affairs. So it's untested. I think it's highly tempting for China to test the will of the new president and set the tone for the next 4 years. So I will see, just a matter of, whether they will use a quarantine first and followed by, after inauguration, if the inauguration speech was not to the satisfaction of China and my launch of Blockade. So I'm a little bit pessimistic, and I intentionally pessimistic so that our new leader can be prepared. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Chen. Admiral Lee, are you on the same page as Dr. Chen?
Yeah, a little bit different, but however, I do worry about the excessive Chinese reaction to the new government in Taipei, and I don't think the wait and see policy is good for China, and I believe China will try to do something and gradually increase the pressure on Taiwan in order to shape the new president's inaugural speech in elegance. And I also worry about if China conduct the large-scale military exercise again in the nearby water and airspace of Taiwan, the conflicts might be happen, especially and the accidents caused by the miscalculation of frontline operators on both sides across the strait. I think that is we should be very focused on that. And finally, I worry about also the results of the United States presidential election in this year. I hope the results of the U.S. presidential election will not make Taiwan's future unpredictable. That is what I worry about in 2024. Thank you.
Thank you. I think what we're seeing is an interesting reverse of our survey results, right? Our survey results show that generally across the board, Taiwan experts are less worried about the PRC threat. At least on this panel, we're seeing that the U.S. experts are less worried, slightly less worried, and the Taiwan experts are slightly more worried. I didn't select this to be this way, but it again shows a diversity of views among leading experts on both sides. But on Admiral Lee's last point, it'll just be the final question I'll ask. First, Ivan and Kristen, if you want to jump in. How might U.S. domestic politics, including our presidential elections, play into China's calculus as you look at this year?
I think that this will be, like China will become a more salient point in this election cycle just than it ever has been before. And that will obviously have an impact on the U.S.-China relationship. And we've seen that sort of with every election in recent years, kind of ramping up in that direction. I think the Biden administration probably knows that, right, and knew that going in, and that may have been one of the factors in their decision to, make sure that the meeting in November in San Francisco went over and sort of get things to a lower baseline, at least rhetorically. I mean, there wasn't a whole lot accomplished, right, in the series of meetings that happened both in Beijing and then, in San Francisco. But I think setting again, sort of lowering the threshold of tensions to a lower baseline with the knowledge that, President Biden's going to have to respond to, as a candidate himself, right? He's not just the president, he's also a candidate on a campaign, and he's going to have to be able to respond to attacks from the other side and from his opponents, that he's being weak, for example, on China and things like that, right? And that'll be generally the picture that's painted, I think, from the Republican side. China will, I think, domestically succeed in largely ignoring, censoring, sort of discounting or talking away that. But I think they're going to have a really hard time in the international space, where they can't obviously censor, at least not nearly as easily. And then it may also compel the Biden administration to take some actions that China's going to have to feel like they have to respond to. So there is some, I think those will be more in the econ tech space, those actions. But there is obviously some potential there, as you mentioned, for escalation in the relationship, if you will.
Yeah, I would just add to that. The two parties I think the outcome of the U.S. election is really sort of a critical thing for how China would view the United States and the U.S.-China relationship. The two parties have very different visions, as far as we know, from, for example, on things like allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific region, and how the U.S. Approaches those types of relationships, and where we would put our effort and our resources. And so I think from that standpoint as well, China is going to be watching very closely, and it also leaves room, if you look at the U.S.-China competition in general, it's partly a competition for influence with allies and partners and building those relationships. And so who becomes president will have implications for that.
Great. With that, I'm going to open the floor to Q&A. I'm going to start from the room first, take 2 questions from the room, and then I'll go to Brian to see if there are any online questions. So please.
Hi, thank you for taking my question. My name is Yuko Mukai from Japanese newspaper Yomiuri Shimbun. My question is follow-up the earlier discussion about how U.S. domestic politics impact on the Taiwan Strait this year. Because my question is also about Ukraine, how Ukraine, supporting Ukraine relates to the Taiwan Strait. And right now there are 2 discussions going on. Supporting Ukraine is very important to show how U.S. tries to advocate democracy, and it also supports Taiwan. But at the same time, the U.S. Resources are limited, so we should put more focus on Asia because it's more U.S. interest. Do you agree that, which one do you agree, the expert? And also, so basically my final question is, if President Trump takes his office again, and he's already implying how the U.S. might do the less commitment to Ukraine, how does it affect to the Taiwan Strait situation in the future? Thank you.
I think before we answer, let's collect another question from the room, please. Here.
Thank you. My name is Tomoyuki Tsugawa. I'm from the Ministry of Defense of Japan, currently studying in the George Washington University, seeking the master's degree. I was curious about the gap of the U.S. and Taiwanese experts' analysis about the Chinese capability, which Kristen mentioned. What do you think the disagreement point between U.S. and Taiwanese experts? What the U.S. experts believe, think, knows, and Taiwanese experts does not, and vice versa?
Great, thank you. So we have, I think, at least 2 questions, if not 3 or 4 questions there. But let me turn to our panelists. Maybe since we went to those here first last time, I'll turn to Dr. Chen and Admiral Lee first. So maybe Dr. Chen, whichever question, if you want to weigh in on it, and you can pass if you don't want to weigh in on any of them.
Ukraine, I think, although admittedly that Taiwan and the Ukraine are competing in the same pool of resource, but we see that there is another layer to support Ukraine from Taiwan's perspective. That is, this is not only about geopolitical conflicts; it's about the conflict of ideas. If we take the dimension out, it's very, just geopolitical. It's about the empires competing with each other. There is no moral higher ground. So it's our hope that the world, especially the U.S., can continue with support for Ukraine, because that make us know that we see this is a competition, a rivalry between democracy and dictatorship. So if we don't support Ukraine, that will become, the whole cause will become very, hypothetic. So I think this is important to support Ukraine, but we will worry that the U.S. will reduce its level of support to Ukraine. About the new president, I probably not in the best position to say something because I have never served in his administration. But from what my reading is that sometimes structure, I'm a sociologist, we believe in structure and context. even though that different leaders have their intentions and the policy goals, but the structure overwhelms its intention. I mean, from the beginning, I mean, except for the telephone call between our President Tsai Ing-wen and at that time President-elect Donald Trump, there was in the first year we were worried. I remember I was serving in the Management Affairs Council. We were worried. However, I mean, the structure is there. I think what we call it a paradigm shift. So you can make some minor adjustment, but I think the general trend is there. So that make a professional pathematic like me less worried about, no matter who got elected as a U.S. president, there will be a big policy change. Why Taiwan experts see Chinese military as less capable? Well, it's mysterious to me too. I also want to get the answer. Probably I can do an interview myself and follow up questions and ask those experts why you see China as less capable. But I don't see it this way. I think they are very capable, and we worry that they are on its way to catch up with the United States, especially the U.S. deployment in the Indo-Pacific region. Yeah.
Hey, thank you, Dr. Chen. Admiral Lee?
That I think from the Taiwan point of view, the Ukraine case cannot compare with the Taiwan's case because of course the United States is a member of NATO, but don't forget the NATO still got a lot of the rich country. So the United States, that is not the only responsibility for the United States, to support the Ukraine. But concerning the Taiwan situation, there's no similar NATO in the Pacific. So especially for the location of the Japan, is very concerned about the attitude of the United States. If United States just let go of the Taiwan, if that is kind of a contingency, and the United States will lose the credibility in this region. And while a lot of the regional countries are playing the hedging strategy at this moment, if the United States will let go of it, Taiwan, it would be terrible. I would not say that's kind of the importance of First Island chain for those kind of things. I believe there will be a different strategic meaning for the Ukraine and the Taiwan for the United States. And concerning the China's capabilities, I still believe that we always thought about the full-scale invasion or blockade. What if China conducted kind of extensive air and the missile bombardment? How would the Taiwanese react? And how would the United States will do? It's a very important question to have both sides discuss, because we didn't discuss a lot on this part. That is my opinion.
Admiral Lee, just to make sure that, if you don't mind me asking the question a little bit pointedly, do you agree with the survey results that you think that shows that most Taiwan experts view China as less capable than U.S. survey respondents? Do you agree with that result? Is that something that you've seen in your discussion with the U.S. military, a different threat assessment picture?
In principle, yes.
Thank you for the direct response. Thank you.
Yeah, and I'll just briefly talk about the Ukraine question and then go to the capabilities question. But so I think, as has been pointed out, I think that Ukraine is a really different situation from Taiwan, and so it's hard to sort of compare it that way. But I do, we do know that China, for example, is studying what's going on in Ukraine, and they are coming up with some lessons learned from that situation, and I think that's also important to understand what they're taking from it. Some of those lessons learned are on how to invest in certain military capabilities for example, that Ukraine is using to fight a stronger military force. Some of it is political, watching how the United States has been able to rally or not rally and sustain resources for supporting Ukraine. So I think, these are sort of trends that China is watching, and some of those might be applied to how they assess a Taiwan situation. So I'll leave it at that and let Ivan address them more. But in terms of the capabilities, I actually don't understand quite the survey responses either, in terms of, because it didn't talk about what capabilities. It didn't ask what capabilities people had questions about. But I would say from a U.S. expert perspective, I mean, the PLA has definitely, Taiwan is their main scenario. The PLA has definitely invested in the capabilities required to conduct a kinetic blockade, joint blockade, or any of its campaigns. Where we have questions are on whether it can do so with issues such as with joint operations. So China's been reforming its military forces to be able to conduct joint operations, but they don't have practice at it. They haven't been in conflict since the Vietnam War. So questions like, can they sustain joint operations? Can they do C2 in a conflict? So those are the types of capabilities that, even though China's invested in the types of weapons and equipment necessary in the training, whether they can put it all together when it comes to a contested conflict is a question.
I guess to Yuko's question, I think I'll throw on top, I guess, at the political level, if you will, the policy level, is there's a disconnect, here in Washington. If you're going to argue, with some people anyway, if you're going to argue that we can do it all, and we have to be careful because there are things that are extremely useful. If you just talk about individual weapon systems, from Stingers to HIMARS, right, including ATACMS, frankly, to Javelins, that are useful in both theaters, that are deficient and we're short of in both theaters. So there has to be some trade-off. And so if you can argue that, and I think I would largely agree that Ukraine is important, and there are sort of these psychological and credibility questions, then you also have to sort of be able to back it up with your proposed defense budget. And I think that's sort of where you get some of the partisan stuff coming through, is sort of, you can't tell a story and then not. That's what Republicans would say to the administration, for example. Some, and then other Republicans would say, well, if you're not going to spend that much, then you do have to make a choice, right, physically, and therefore you hear some, obviously on the right, saying, no, we should focus what we have on Taiwan. So there is logic behind it. The other, on the capability question, I think there's also, in Taiwan, there's been through an election year, there's been a conscious decision, I believe anyway, by the DPP to sort of play down the war versus peace, like don't let that narrative come up. And so maybe that plays into when we take the survey. So I'd be curious, if in a similar question 6 months from now, it's the same, because, I think, the Taiwanese government has been, rightly so, I think, worried about also like foreign investment not coming into Taiwan, things like that. And so there's also political reasons to have less of a threat perception, obviously, in Taiwan.
Great, thank you. So I think we are about 1 minute from the end of the panel, but I did want to make sure we gave time for at least one online question. So Brian, please, if there's...
Yeah, so one of the questions here is, how much does the porousness of a blockade or quarantine matter in terms of, how much does the PLA or the China Coast Guard have to stop for that to be effective? And, how does that porousness also affect Taiwan's response and U.S. and allied responses?
So a very technical question. Whoever wants to jump in, or maybe we could have this food for thought if no one wants to jump in. It's a very technical one.
I'll just jump in real quick. So I think the porousness does matter in terms of if China wants to send a signal, for example, and just blocks certain types of goods and commodities, which is hard to do because you have to know what ships they're coming in on and things like that. But if they decided to do that and still allowed food and energy supplies to go into Taiwan, I think that could go on for a longer period of time, and it would send maybe in Beijing's mind it would send a signal. And lead to something, a signal and maybe lead to discussions in their mind. But so it would matter in terms of whether it's a total blockade versus a more porous one.
So with that, I do want to thank our 4 panelists for joining, and particularly for our Taiwan colleagues who are staying up late into the night to join us today. So let's give them a round of applause, and thank you everyone for joining us today.